I'm using the slides as notes. They are going to be very text-heavy slides, but hopefully you'll be able to follow along. Okay? Stop. Okay, so as it says, my topic is going to be looking at adverse health events associated with performance and image-enhancing drugs. And this is based on an ethnography I conducted in gyms in the local area in the southwest, around Plymouth, Newton Abbot, Exeter. So it's all very local stuff, all very relevant. And as I said, it's really good qualitative data, it's descriptive. So I'm going to be using a lot of quotes from participants so you can really get an idea of how they experienced these events. But first I'm going to provide a bit of background, just because I don't know how familiar any of you are with the topic of performance-enhancing drugs. So traditionally they were associated with athletes in sporting events, and of course in hardcore, or what we term hardcore user subcultures, such as bodybuilders and powerlifters. And this is traditionally where these drugs have been used, primarily anabolic steroids are the main one, generally used helping build muscle mass, gaining strength for sporting competition. But what we've seen in recent years is an increasing normalization of these drugs outside of these groups that historically used them. So I've listed a few researchers who have looked into this. Kindergarten McVeigh, Bates McVeigh, they found that a lot of young men are now visiting these more commercial type gyms, or the more modern setting of gym, and they're using steroids and they're using fat burners in order to just look good, generally either for sort of hedonic, nighttime economy oriented activities, going to nightclubs and taking off their shirts and posing and that sort of thing, or for social media seems to be a big one. So as I've noted there, we've got Mulrooney and Van de Ven and Bleecker have looked into this phenomenon of steroid use specifically for social media, what's termed the steroid selfie. And this can be done either for sexual reasons, trying to attract partners, or it can be done, there's a sort of macho culture, this lad culture, which I'll discuss a bit in this presentation, where men are sort of trying to assert dominance over each other and establish a hierarchy, and the body is a part of that. So that's the background, but as we can see, I've just listed the official statistics we've managed to gather, which then the years 2015 to 2017, only a 2-year period, reported steroid use quadrupled in 16 to 24-year-olds. So it does seem a lot of the increasing use in steroids which is being observed is due to these young men, teenagers and early 20s, who want to look good for social media and are doing it for social approval. And that's distinct from the historical cases in the 1990s, or the research was into bodybuilders, because they were the main groups using steroids. So as I've noted here, as use increases in these casual user subcultures, and I will detail the approaches of the subcultures, I think that's in the next slide, but these subcultures have less background in use, there's less ethnopharmacological knowledge, they don't have quite such strict disciplines of use, so they tend to use in more harmful manners. And as we see the growth of use in these subcultures, we can imagine that's going to lead to more negative health events, and that might require certain social policy decisions in order to minimize them. But of course, all subcultures are subject to some of these harms, and as we'll see, powerlifters, even though they are quite strict in their use, they're relatively cautious compared to other subcultures, there still is harm in these what could be termed disciplined or hardcore subcultures. So I just got a brief note on the research methodology. As I said, it was an ethnography. I was going into gyms. I got involved in the project because I was training in gyms, and I saw that there was a demand for a researcher looking into steroids, and I knew a few guys who were already using steroids, so it was a natural fit for me. So part of it was in-gym observations, making notes in field diary and categorizing those, and I also conducted some semi-structured interviews, recorded interviews, and transcribed those. So I'm going to be using a lot of quotes throughout, and that's data that I've managed to gather from these interviews and from my experiences in the gym. And then comparative analysis, grounded theory, Glaser and Strauss, just identifying categories, identifying properties of categories. Obviously, having trained in gyms myself, I had certain preconceived notions about subcultures, and I wanted to explore these, try and develop categories and properties from these, and then adapt those and generate the theory from that. So that was my research methodology. So as I said, there's these different subcultures that use these performance-enhancing drugs, and I felt that a good way of understanding how this use occurs is to picture it as a spectrum. So I've just got the structure that I'm using roughly, where we have the disciplined approach that's associated with these classical subcultures or the hardcore subcultures, such as powerlifters, fighters, and competitive bodybuilders, more towards the image-oriented end of that. So they use slightly differently than those who are doing it specifically for sport, but because they're competitive, they still have a certain discipline and certain prescribed ways of using the drugs. And then on the opposite end, what can be termed this hedonic use, this very casual approach comparative to these competitive subcultures. And this is the lad culture I was saying about, nightclub and social media oriented. Workout culture, which is very similar but without the associations with binge drinking and so on. So still primarily young guys working out in gyms to look buff. And then CrossFit and the sort of amateur bodybuilders are somewhere between these, wherein they are social media and image oriented, so they don't use quite as strictly or as in such a disciplined manner as the powerlifters and competitive sportsmen, but they're not fully hedonic. They are thinking a bit longer term. And as I've noted there is a certain exploration to be had regarding masculinities. So my exploration of the masculine archetypes of the rival sides of the spectrum, that's on YouTube if anyone's interested. And I can provide a link on request. So here we go, as you can see, powerlifters adopt this cautious approach to use. They tend to be knowledgeable. They tend to combine their own independent research from the internet and various sources with a cultural ethnopharmacology. So within powerlifting subculture, there's very much this rigid discipline wherein if one powerlifter sees another who's using in a what they would term a stupid manner, using too much, not paying attention, not using accessory drugs, they take it upon themselves to say, I need to make sure this person uses sensibly. And you could imagine that in the context of they don't want their sport to gain a bad reputation, so they're trying to minimize any negatives associated with the sport. And we saw this somewhat with bodybuilders when the idea of roid rage was a big phenomenon in the 1990s, early 2000s. A lot of bodybuilders tried to minimize that by saying, look, a lot of this is just guys who are idiots and want to start fights are then using steroids. So there was quite a concerted effort by bodybuilders to try and minimize that harm. So as we can see, powerlifters, a general dose is used at between 500 milligrams and 800 milligrams of PEERS a week. I appreciate at this stage that won't particularly tell you anything, but when we compare it to the other subcultures, that will give you an idea of the difference in use. And as I've noted, the target for powerlifters, they're often looking at a long-term goal. They want to be competitive in several years' time. So they're going to plan their use of these drugs around wanting to remain competitive in 4 or 5 years' time. So when we look at the sort of image-oriented gym users, which is workout culture, amateur bodybuilders, they generally use drugs that they're able to access, as opposed to powerlifters who will use specific drugs for specific purposes. So there's quite a stark divide that I've noted. Powerlifters will tend to use the drug boldenone undecylonate, and these regular gym users tend to use decadurabolin. So these are two drugs with similar effects, but the powerlifters are very specific about they want the boldenone because it has less associated side effects, whereas the gym users tend to rely on deca because it's more easily available. And we can see in Bates and McVeigh's longitudinal study of iPad use, they use the term iPads, I'm using PEERS, it's the same thing, performance and image or image and performance. In their study, they found that deca, which is not really used by hardcore users, powerlifters, tends to be one of the most used drugs. So that kind of indicates that this subculture, the gym trainers, the workout culture, they would seem to be one of the larger subcultures that are using. But as I've noted, they don't seem to have the same discipline or temperament that we see amongst powerlifters. They don't normally see training as being so long-term. They're often, because they're training for current insecurities they want to make up, because they feel they're too small or they're not impressive comparatively, they tend to use in higher dosages to try and get more rapid results. So quite frequently I've spoken to members of this subculture who used in excess of 1 gram of steroids a week. Powerlifters would consider that a high dose. That seems to be a very normal dose for regular gym-going male participants. And of course that's interesting in and of itself, that the competitive subculture that are trying to increase their strength as much as possible are using less performance-enhancing drugs than this more casual subculture. So that probably tells you something about the acquisition of knowledge amongst these subcultures and their understanding of the effects of the drugs. And then lastly, I've noted lag culture, but this whole sort of hedonic, nightclub-oriented subculture, they tend to share drugs between friends, not as in they're sharing syringes, but as in, if one has access to a certain drug, he'll say to all his friends, oh, you should get on this one. Did I include a quote? Oh, yeah. So Pete is a member of this subculture, and he's given a couple of examples of how his friends will use the drugs like Smarties, the oral ones. They'll just take a handful and use whatever because they want the results as rapidly as possible. So the temporal horizon of this subculture, I would say, is the shortest, or they have the highest time preference. And we've got the example, Pete says, what they're really focused on is summer in Ibiza. So they don't care about 3-4 years in advance. They care about how am I going to look when I go on holiday, how's it going to affect me. So Big Steve, I've quoted here, he's an old school bodybuilder of the type that previous research from the late 90s, early 2000s looked at. And he comments that, he did not admit to being a supplier when I was interviewing him, but he sort of hinted towards he knows pretty well what guys in the gym are using. So I'll leave it at that. But he said he knows young men, teenage boys, early 20s, who are using 1 gram of testosterone every day. So compared to the 500 to 800 milligrams per week of the powerlifters, we can see this is an incredibly high dose, and that's likely to cause harms, as I'll get to in the later part of this presentation. So as I've noted here, the user categories are going to be relevant to the coming discussion of harms, but because harms were experienced by users from every subculture, every category, I'm not going to separate them out. I'm going to discuss them together, but I will be attributing the users discussed to the subculture, so it'll say if they're a powerlifter or a gym user, etc. So types of harm experienced from the use of, this is particularly steroids, which tend to be the injectable drugs which are used. There are some pill form drugs, as I said, Pete's friends who take fat burners, quote, like Smarties, and I will be mentioning fat burners towards the end, but primarily I'm going to be focusing on anabolic steroids, and I am going to be focusing on male users, because I only had one female participant in my research who discussed her use of anabolics and performance enhancers. So this is primarily from a male perspective. As we can see, there's a lot of common effects to steroids which are anticipated by the vast majority of users. Occasionally you'll get a teenager who doesn't know about these effects because he's just had a friend say, I'll take this and you'll get much bigger, from these more hedonic user subcultures. But generally they're aware of these harms such as insomnia, acne, water retention, increased sweating, irritability, and these are usually anticipated effects. Even amongst quite casual users, they are aware steroids have some negative effects associated with them. So that's not particularly going to be the focus of this presentation because they're anticipated harms. So I'm going to focus on the ones that users don't tend to anticipate so much, which could be termed eventful harms. So I've just listed the 3 common categories that eventful harms fall into, and it tends to be problems with administration, so injections, I would assume you're all aware that injections are going to be one of the most probable areas where users are going to cause harm, but a lot of users don't seem to quite anticipate some of the risks with injecting. There's also unexpected adverse reactions to the product itself, and we're going to be exploring ideas of sterility of product, the cleanliness, and how product is manufactured in that portion, and then some of the severe health impacts that I witnessed or was told about. So I'm just going to explore each of these in turn, and then I'm going to, I've written that wrong, and then discuss sort of the harm reduction context of that. So, starting with problems with administration. As Bates and McVeigh found in their longitudinal study, and as I found in my ethnography, injectable anabolic androgenic steroids seem to be one of the most commonly used forms of performance enhancers. So this is drugs such as testosterone, or as I mentioned earlier, deca-durabolin. And obviously injecting drug users are subject to certain risks, whatever drugs they're injecting. So I will come to stigma later, but obviously there's some perception amongst steroid users. They see themselves as separate to other injecting drug users, so they don't feel as though they need to behave in a way that would be prescribed for, say, heroin users. But of course, anyone who is injecting illicit drugs is subject to these harms. So as Eddie, who's a gym user, one of the more casual subcultures, he's noted that most of the issues he's actually heard of where people have had problems using steroids, they've come when the person's actually been injecting, and they've been due to not knowing how to inject properly. They might have hit an artery or a vein and caused themselves some problems. And Josh, who similarly, he's more of a casual user, gym user, he says that he's hit a vein when injecting, and he felt that it affected his nervous system. He injected in the vein and then was ill for a few weeks after, didn't feel right, felt out of sorts. So two very similar experiences there. So that does seem to be one of the key areas where harm is being caused, is particularly amongst these more casual used subcultures. There's not the awareness of how to inject properly and how to avoid these harms. And then we have Martin, who's a powerlifter. So again, as I said, we witnessed these types of harms from all the subcultures. So Martin was probably the most informed, most cautious user that I spoke to in the course of this ethnography. But even he experienced a harm from injecting. He said he got an infection and it spread halfway down his leg from injecting in his glute. And he had to go to the doctor and get antibiotics for that. So clearly injection's one of the key areas where harm occurs with the use of these drugs. Now, as I've noted at the bottom there, some of this harm is potentially linked with ignorance of safe injecting procedures. And that sort of begs the question of why, in terms of we have needle and syringe programs that are free and readily available, why aren't users familiar with how to inject? So I want to discuss this topic, needle and syringe programs, and the stigma that's attached to them. So Kimgord and McVeigh actually did a survey of needle and syringe programs, and they found that peered users actually seem to be the majority of clientele for these services now. And to an extent, that shows just how much the use of these drugs has increased in recent years. That the majority of, that was 2014, obviously we've noted the statistics indicate it's increased even more since then. And basically every needle and syringe program they looked at, more than half of the clients were peered users. So the question is, well then why are these harms occurring? And what I've found in my research and what Simmons and Kuma have suggested is this idea that there is nonetheless still a stigma attached to using these services because of the association with injecting drug users. And I've got a few quotes here that sort of illustrate these concerns. So the first is Simon, who's a gym user. He experienced some harms, but he notes he didn't go to Boots because he was scared that people who he knows who work in Boots would see him with a bin full of needles and infer onto him more negative connotations because he was an injecting drug user, as opposed to a steroid user being distinct. So he felt a lot more comfortable just going online, buying needles from eBay, and then just typing in online, I presume in Google, how to inject. So he learned to inject from the internet as opposed to visiting one of these programs. Then we have Rich. Rich is a powerlifter and fairly cautious in his use, but he knows he went and picked up needles for other people in his gym, other powerlifters, because even amongst this hardcore subculture, not all of them wants to visit these spaces because they don't want to be seen there, they're a bit nervous. Now, Rich lives more up towards where I am in Newton, and he would come and pick up the needles down here in Plymouth for his friends who were in Plymouth, who wouldn't necessarily want to come to a needle exchange here. So that just shows that even though, as Keemagon and McVeigh's research indicates, there are steroid users who will go to these services, it's supposed to be they only provide needles for the individual, and you are asked, are these for personal use? But as we see from Rich's quote, actually, you can get away with asking for more and giving them out to friends, etc. So Rich is receiving all the advice he's supposed to. The guys he's then supplying, not so much. And at the more extreme end of this, with the lad culture, the more hedonic users, it's sort of a mix between these. The initial point of contact is someone ordering them online, as Simon did, and then he just gives them to his friends in the gym, as Rich does. So in that instance, there's no information going across. So, as I've noted, this leads to a situation where users are being exposed to physical harm in not knowing how to inject properly, because the social harm of being seen in one of these needle and syringe spaces is too great, and they don't wish to be associated with injecting drug users. There's too much stigma attached to it. So one of the solutions proposed to this is whether needle and syringe programs should be provided in gyms to help avoid this issue. So Aiken and Delalande did a study on this in Australia with a bodybuilder visiting bodybuilding gyms and giving needles, syringes to other bodybuilders, and they found some success there. But as I've noted, we've now seen a shift towards younger men who are doing it, less experienced, less grounded in these subcultures. So maybe we need to adapt that approach if we were looking at bringing that sort of project over here so that we could catch these more casual types of user. And I have noted there is the possibility, of course, that this might normalise or encourage use if it's seen to be sanctioned by the gyms themselves. So if you had the management saying, oh, here's how to use safely, that might actually encourage use. So in constructing such a program, obviously you would have to be quite careful in how you did it, trying to fall somewhere between what we saw with Aiken and Delalande's work and something that seems more officially sanctioned, such as people actually resident in the gyms giving out needles and syringes and advice. And as I've noted at the bottom there, yeah, these commercial gyms, such as the gym in town, these are the ones that really seem to need to focus, because this is where more of the harmful use is going on. So moving to the second form of harm that was experienced, of these eventful harms, there's adverse reactions to product. So quite a few users, they would inject the product, and in some cases perhaps this was associated with poor injecting practices. In other cases it doesn't seem to have been. So I've just got a few examples here. We have Simon, who I referenced earlier. He says he had a really bad reaction when he injected and came up in hives. And he attributes that to the product itself being unclean, although as noted in the previous slides, Simon was one of the users who just bought needles online, so sterility issues might come up there. And then Rich, who's a powerlifter, so Rich actually visited the needle and syringe program, received clean needles, was told how to inject properly, and he's noted that he got really itchy when he was injecting testosterone, had to take antihistamines, and he thinks that's the product itself. So whether he was allergic to the testosterone or something in it, we don't know 100%, but he is under the impression that there was something bad in the product itself. So a lot of these steroids are made up in underground labs, as they're called. I'll get to that later. but there is a perception that the product itself is unclean in a lot of cases. And Martin, who I noted on slide 6, he had the infection after injecting, had to go to the doctor, it had spread halfway down his leg, and he says actually his girlfriend's mum is a nurse and watched him inject and made sure that he had injected it properly, and yet he still experienced this harm. So that tends to suggest that some of these harms are not just from poor injecting practices, but might be attributable to the quality of the drugs themselves. So a lot of users are taking what's called underground product or product from underground labs, and this is worth exploring in terms of these issues. So underground product is generally legitimate steroid powders which are created in labs, often in China or India, and then they're redirected, taken away from legitimate applications and sent to people who order them, usually over the internet, and that gets delivered here in powder form, and then it's essentially the suppliers buy it as a powder and they brew it up into an injectable vial form. So they mix it with oil and alcohol and create a product that can be injected. And there is some potential that this is why we're seeing some negative reactions. And users who have become familiar with this process, who are aware that this is what's happening, they tend to say, well, this is why I had the issue, this is why I had the infection. So I got the example of Martin, who had the infection, says, on reflection, he's moved, he now uses pharmaceutical grade product, but reflecting back on that first batch he used where he got the infection, he says that could just be made up in someone's kitchen with his cat walking around licking the bowl for all he knows. And yeah, that's the fact is with these underground products, we don't necessarily know the conditions they're made in. And Llewellyn and Tober explored this, that there's great variation. Some are made in clean rooms using real lab equipment, and some are literally just two guys in their living room pouring oils into a heated vial, and that's about it. So Rich, discussing that product that made him very itchy, he says that's from this brand called GB Pharma, to imply it's pharmaceutical quality, when of course it isn't at all, it's just somebody brewing it up at home. So he says, from what I've got online, typing in lab names, it turns out that's bathtub brew, where someone's brewed it up in their bathtub, basically. It's not farm stuff, it's not good stuff. So this is a powerlifter who, as noted, they tend to be more informed than any of the other user types, and yet he's still had this issue where he's bought a product that's labelled pharma, and it's not at all. So, and as Josh, who was a gym user, again, Josh experienced problems, and he's pointed out, in reality, you don't know what you're putting in your body. You don't know how legitimate the products that you're buying from the black market in gyms or from the internet, you don't know how legitimate it is. So I've noted there is some potential bias towards unfavourable perceptions just because it tends to be the only individuals who talk about the process of creating product in underground labs. They're the ones who have already had negative experiences because they're the only ones who tend to research, well, why did this product give me an infection? Why did this product make me ill? So there is some potential for bias there, but as I know, Ross Coomer and his team did some quantitative testing of product from Plymouth, and they found that nearly all of it was non-pharmaceutical, and often it contains far less product than is advertised. It might contain a different product. So we can see just from this, there is great potential for it to be unsterile if, even on the quantitative content side, it's not what it claims to be. So, you'll have to forgive the terrible pun in the title, The Good, the Bad, and the UGLY, Underground Lab. That's sort of a shorthand that's used generally in internet forum discussions of these. But we can see these were all, I think these are all from Plymouth. No, they're all from the southwest at least, that they've been sourced. So this is an example of 3 different types of underground product that's available in the local area. So the first one I have here is custom anabolics. And as we can see, it doesn't try and pass itself off as being of pharmaceutical quality. It makes clear that it is an underground product. It's custom anabolics, so it's to some extent an honest product. So it might not be what it claims on the label quantitatively. It might say it's 400 milligrams of testosterone and it's only 250, for example, but it's not trying to pass as being pharmaceutical grade. And we can contrast this with the other two. Infinity comes in a very professionally made box and says prescription medicine on it. So people are under the impression, oh, this is a redirected pharmaceutical quality. As we see for other drugs, such as methylphenidate, tends to be redirected pharmaceutical. But in the case of this, it is in fact an underground product brewed by somebody in their house. It's just made more professionally than the others. So that one's a very good quality underground product, but it's also very deceptive. And you sort of wonder, well, if they have sterility issues with a batch of that, it's going to cause a lot more harm because people aren't aware in advance that they're using an underground product. And then finally, GB Pharma, which we've already seen a complaint about. As you can see, that's not gone to the same effort to try and prove it's pharmaceutical. It doesn't have the outside box, it doesn't have anything to say it's prescription medicine, but it does call itself pharma, implying that it's a pharmaceutical product. So this will trick some people, and especially because nobody actually ever sees steroids on pharmacy shelves in the UK. So if you are told, oh yeah, I've got this pharma product, GB Pharma, and a guy in the gym sells it, they don't really have anything to kind of compare it to and say, well, this doesn't look legitimate. So that's sort of the worst kind, to be honest, because that one probably is just made by somebody at home, at least with the Infinity, because of the, as you can see, the professional level of creating the vials and the labels. We would tend to hope that the lab will actually be of quite high quality because they're clearly trying to sell a brand with some recognition as high quality, whereas GB Pharma, not so much. It's slap a label on it to say it's pharmaceutical and see how many people you can fool, essentially. So just a bit of discussion on that, because I did speak to somebody who was involved in this process of bringing in powders from China and brewing up a product in one of these labs. And he said, actually, he questions some of the claims regarding how dirty underground product is, because from his personal experience, they put out quite a sterile product, and they had some people trying to say it was fake to spread rumours because they didn't like the guy who they bought it from in the gym. He documented some efforts at sort of shaking down their brand by spreading rumours and lying. So he said some of it is just petty maliciousness. And you can see this might be legitimate because, as Llewellyn and Tobin note, the process of adding alcohol in large quantities will tend to render product sterile. So maybe it is over-exaggerated, the harms. As I noted earlier, there is a bias towards people who have had negative experiences tend to then discover this process of creating underground product, and then it tends to be they latch on to the idea of it's dirty as opposed to they might have done something wrong. And Jim notes that actually a lot of people claim that product is dirty when they've just experienced pain from injecting, and he says actually when you're injecting steroids you can expect to experience pain because it's being mixed in with alcohol. So there is some room for debate there. It would be interesting to do large-scale quantitative testing and see what we could detect in all of these. So that's a potential area for future research. So I have noted there is the possibility that to some extent these concerns are a bit of moral panic, but at the same time, as Martin's experience indicates, where he had a registered nurse watch him and make sure he injected absolutely correctly, and he still had a horrendous infection. That probably indicates he really did have a dirty vial, and that this is a real concern. So, a bit of discussion on that. Demand is growing, as noted. A lot more young men are using these drugs now. That means it's going to be more profitable for anybody who tries to create a product at home. So anyone can kind of get on the internet, find out a source in China that's selling these raw powders, can buy it very cheap, and then can brew it up in their house with some. It's quite easy to do if you're not worried about sterility, you're not worried about making a high quality product. Llewellyn and Toba talk through it in their piece, and yeah, essentially it can be done with some quite basic equipment. So More profit, not very high barrier to entry. I can see the potential for more of these underground labs opening, which perhaps would create more harm because they won't be like Infinity, where it is very specifically trying to make a high-end product. It will just be people at home, so more potential for harm there. So I've noted, as with the needle and syringe programs, of this idea of outreach workers going into gyms and trying to give the information to people who need it the most. Perhaps we need to make an awareness of the cleanliness of this underground product and the potential for product that's labelled as pharma to not actually be pharma. We need to make that more of a focus in this kind of outreach education work. There is some subcultural awareness, especially amongst powerlifters and even a few of the casual gym users. But as I said, in the casual gym users, it tended to be only after they had had a bad experience that they discovered this, because they went online and looked it up. So yeah, more quantitative research along the lines of Ross Kuma's work could help in this, because new labs are always springing up. New products, new branded product is always coming out. It might not even be new labs, it might just be an old lab that gets a bad reputation, slaps a new label on. Jim, the supplier, spoke about that as one of the things that occurs. So if we could sort out some kind of quantitative testing, if analytical services could team up with researchers in the field such as myself, there might be a way of keeping up-to-date information in these gyms so that people are aware of what product is good and what is, going to be harmful to use. So that's another potential angle for outreach. So moving to the last, these 3 identified eventful harms that I wanted to talk about, it's the more serious negative health impacts associated just with the use of performance enhancers. So I've got a few sources here which indicate the harms of using performance enhancers are quite dose dependent. If you use longer term and at higher dosages, there's a lot more risk of harms presenting than when cycling at lower dosages. So Monahan found for his bodybuilders, they observed this sort of convexity effect for harms, and they tended to keep their doses lower because of this. And I found the exact same thing with the powerlifters. Powerlifters were saying there is no need to fill up a syringe. You're not going to get much more benefit from taking a lot of product, but you are going to get a lot more harms, which is why we saw the discrepancy. The very worst members of hedonic subcultures were using 1 gram of testosterone a day. Powerlifters would rarely use above 800 milligrams a week, and it was normally 500. 500 was about the median. So this does create the potential, now that we see a lot more of these younger guys, members of these workout culture and lag culture, they might be causing more harm to themselves because they're using these higher dosages, and that's linked to temporal horizons, that's linked to the urgency that social media creates. Social media creates this obsession where I need to make these gains now because I'm being viewed now. Your whole life is public. And that was the focus of my talk at the Australian Sociological Association. But just looking at these examples, so again, we've got Big Steve pointing out that he knows some of the teenagers in his gym, some of the young guys are using 1,000 milligrams of testosterone every day. And Pete, who's a member of lag culture, he's talking about his friends, and he says, look, these lads, they've got no issue putting stuff into their body. They'll just take whatever will give them the gains that they need for partying on the weekend, for somewhere in Ibiza. So certainly a lot of harms caused by this risk-taking behaviour. They have, a greater chance of behaving in a way that's going to generate these harms. So Pete's peer group really just epitomised this short temporal horizon overuse of drugs creating harms. So one of his friends, he notes, had a heart attack on a night out 2 years ago, and he says they all say to this friend, taking this many enhancers, this many fat burners, your heart rate's got to be all over the place. And this friend has to go to the doctor to have his heart rate monitored every month, still takes fat burners. Pete says this friend takes 4 different kinds of fat burner just to try and keep in shape, even though he's already had a heart attack. Pete was 23 at the time I spoke to him. I imagine this friend was about the same age, so it gives you some idea. Pete's other friend Mike had a mark on his skin, 12 millimeters, obviously thought it was a melanoma. His GP told him, get yourself to the hospital, and he notes, Mike, he just has this such an obsessive mindset that he thought, if I'm going to have to go to hospital and I'm going to be, cooped up inside for a few weeks, I'm going to have to inject myself with a tanning drug, melanotan, now to make sure I don't lose my tan during my stay, and I'm going to hit the sunbeds before I go. And we can compare this to sort of body dysmorphic disorder and these sort of severe negative mental conditions that can make guys behave in these really harmful manners. But at the same time, Pete's saying, well, this is the sort of mindset of these lads. He doesn't see Mike's behaviour as being so out of the ordinary that it must be a psychological disorder. He just sees it as this is just the mindset of these lads. That, oh, I'm going into hospital, therefore I've got to make sure I tan in advance so I don't come out looking too pale. And I mentioned his friend who had the heart attack. Pete has 3 friends in total who have had heart attacks in their 20s. And we look at some of the members of this culture more broadly. Aziz Shavasham was like a mini online celebrity for this kind of amateur bodybuilding type of subculture, died at the age of 22 of a heart attack. Now, he did have a pre-existing condition, but you have to wonder whether adding steroids and fat burners and so on top might have shortened his lifespan. Dan Bilzerian, another sort of celebrity, juiced up guy, had 2 heart attacks when he was 25. So again, it does sort of show, I'm not saying everyone who uses in these sorts of dosages are going to experience these kind of harms, but it does seem to compound the chances of having a severe negative health event. And as I said, it seems to be largely based on the short temporal horizons of this obsession with being in shape for the summer and showing off on Facebook. There's also potentially a kind of element to machismo of this. Oh, my friend's taking X amount, therefore I have to be able to take that to show that I can handle the same dose that he's having. So there's some interesting work on masculinities to be explored there as well, I think. And as I know, powerlifters, they don't tend to experience so many of these problems because they're planning more longer term, so they don't have the desperate need to use a lot in the here and now. Although some powerlifters obviously have had issues from using too many steroids, especially when you get up to the top end guys on the world stage, because when you're at that level you have to use a lot, even though it massively increases negative side effects. That's just part of the game. So, as I said, you see these harms across all the user subcultures. So in terms of powerlifters experiencing potential harms and acting recklessly, Rich, who I said earlier, he was quite informed. He was one of the few guys who actually went to visit needle and syringe programs, but he finished cycling and you have testicular atrophy whilst you're actually on steroids. And then guys cycle steroids, they have a period of several weeks when they're on steroids, then they'll come off to allow their bodies to recover and then go back on. He comes off the steroids, his testicles start to come back, but the left one is about, I think he said it was twice the size of the right. I've got much bigger in this actual quote. And he said he was worried he had testicular cancer, but what's his response? He goes to online forums looking for advice because he didn't want to go to the doctor and tell his doctor that he was using steroids. So it's this really strong perception of stigma. I don't want anybody to know that I've harmed myself from using steroids, so I'm going to the doctor as a last resort. As I'm sure you guys are aware, testicular cancer is one of the cancers where you want to catch it early because it is very treatable early stages, but can quickly become fatal. So that's a bit of a concern. And Rich wasn't the only one who discussed medical records. Rich was the only one who admitted to having this sort of level of harm experienced and not going to see the doctor. But quite a few said they'd have minor issues and didn't want to go to the doctor. Now I've noted, because this research took place, we obviously have a couple of Marine barracks down in South Devon, in Plymouth and up at Lympstone, so the military is seen more as a career option down here, so perhaps this fear of doctors and medical records is a bit over-exaggerated in my sample, just because of the geographic location where it took place. But Lee Monaghan, working in South Wales, talking to bodybuilders, so again one of these hardcore subcultures, he experienced the same thing, this idea of challenging medicine. They didn't trust doctors. And as Pete notes, when he's talking about the friend who had a heart attack and is still taking these enhancers, he says, well, he never mentioned to me, he said to the doctors, he's doing stuff. I think he keeps it quiet. And based on the other responses from people I've spoken to, it does very much seem to be they don't want to deal with doctors. Martin was the only one who went to see a doctor because he had that infection and had to get antibiotics. So again, this points to this idea of perhaps we need more of these in-gym services where users can get medical advice, they can get information they need without having to go to a place that might be associated with injecting drug users such as heroin users, because there is that fear of stigma. And maybe perhaps just being referred, if there was someone in the gym who was seen as an authority source and they came to them with a problem and that person said, go and see a doctor, maybe that would make them more inclined to get the medical help as well. So I am aware there's some schemes being piloted, such as specific steroid clinics in a few cities. So it'll be interesting to see what effect those have on referrals to GPs or hospitals, and whether those help reduce some of this stigma, because it's a space for gym users, so they don't have to worry about people might associate me with heroin use, etc. And then potentially, if those are successful, these schemes could come to cities such as Plymouth. So just a summary of some of the key findings there. Obviously, the different subcultures experienced harms at different frequencies and magnitudes depending on their patterns of use and subcultural disciplines, and they responded to harms differently, but all of these groups did have members that experienced harm of some sort in these eventful or less anticipated ways. And even though I only really noted heart attacks and that really reckless behaviour in hedonic user subcultures, Rich, as an example of a powerlifter with his cancer scare, that shows that even in spite of the increased knowledge level amongst powerlifters, there's still massive potential for harm. So the key areas of unanticipated harm, as noted, were the injecting process, negative reactions to product, which is generally from these underground labs, and health risks associated with using in high doses and for prolonged periods. And powerlifters particularly seem to pick up on the middle of these, but again, every subculture experienced all of them to some extent. Stigma seems to be one of the major issues in terms of harm reduction, harm minimization policy, and just building on Lee Monahan's work. Lee Monahan observed this amongst bodybuilders in the 90s, and I'm observing it today amongst all subcultures. So it does seem Monahan's work can be more broadly generalized. This distrust of doctors, distrust of visiting NSPs, and even though powerlifters were more inclined to visit NSP, Rich describing how he would share out needles in the gym with guys who didn't want to go clearly indicates this perception of stigma even amongst these really hardcore subcultures. And then at the bottom, obviously, just to summarize sort of this idea, there are prescribed protocols and anticipated harms, but sometimes even things that could be readily anticipated, users would still be harmed. They either through their behaviours or, in Martin's case, for example, he just wasn't aware he was using a dirty product at the time. And I've noted about Shane Blackman's hidden ethnography, and I think this is really relevant because, as I said, the only powerlifter who did something as reckless and sort of stupid, sorry Reg, as the hedonic user subcultures, he was reluctant. He didn't say that to me in our formal interview. We had our formal interview in, I think, June, and it took until I was in the gym and saw him in September of that year, so about 3 months later, that he then said in conversation with me in the gym, he said, oh yeah, I didn't mention this in interview, but... So again, we're talking about areas of insecurity because it's related to genitalia. It's, you know, quite an embarrassing thing to talk about. And luckily, Rich and I, we're friends, we get on well. Some of the respondents I spoke to, I'm not as good friends with as I am with Rich. I would consider Rich a friend. Some of them were just people I sort of knew because I'd met them in the gym. So yes, I did only have one example of a powerlifter experiencing this sort of harm, but you can see how that kind of detail, that kind of thing, might get lost and they won't talk about it, because Rich, in the end, obviously didn't have testicular cancer. So that wouldn't show up in any statistics, that wouldn't necessarily show up in any longitudinal studies asking about experience. That's just sort of pure chance that came to light because of the in-depth nature and the fact I was talking to a guy I knew well. So there's the potential for a lot more of that sort of harm, which guys might not even talk about because it's embarrassing. So really, we don't know the extent of harms that's occurring. This is the final thing I wanted to talk about, which is just the idea of potential health benefits of PID use, because this is something that I discovered whilst I was in the field. Was there were a couple of examples of people who used these drugs and actually seemed to be better off because of their use. So I'll read the section at the bottom noting what Ross Coomer says about this distinction between what's a good drug and a bad drug is often constructed based on muddy thinking and moral positioning. And yeah, it's quite easy to forget when we talk about these drugs and we see the harms they cause. Actually, a lot of these are prescription medicines. They're just not prescribed in this country, but elsewhere in the world it's used as medicine. So I thought it's just interesting to note a couple of these cases. So Mariusz, for example, was a wrestler, and that kind of entertainment wrestling, like the WWE style, but a local version of that. And he said, because they have to do shows non-stop, and his income is based on his ability every week to be able to go out and do a wrestling show, he's in constant chronic pain from all his joints, ligaments, taking so much damage from wrestling. And he points out, wrestlers, particularly in America, but here as well, frequently turn to opioid painkillers to help them get through, to help them perform. And he said, being able to take steroids and human growth hormone helped me to stay off doing what these other guys were doing and taking opioids. So it's worth considering that. Is he actually in a better position by using the steroids than if he stayed off them and used opiates, which could potentially be even more dangerous? Sort of abuse of one drug to stop abusing another, if you will. So I thought that was an interesting finding. And then Rose is very interesting. As I said, the only female participant in my research. I think I cite 28 people in the thesis, and Rose was the only female who spoke to me on this topic. But she had joint hypermobility syndrome and had a lot of problem with her ligaments, was in a lot of pain. Again, very similar case, except in Mariusz you can say it's self-inflicted almost, even though it is to allow him to live. It's for his career. He's still, in a way, doing it to himself. Rose, obviously, this is just a condition she was born with, and she was given opiates by her doctor, asked her doctor, can you give me any treatment as opposed to just managing symptoms? And they said no, and she went online, saw someone say, take human growth hormone, it might help, and she bought some from China and said, yeah, it made differences. That physiotherapists would look at her and say, you shouldn't be able to walk, how the hell are you able to do those things? So I just think that is relevant to the discussion. Yes, these drugs can be very harmful, and certainly when they're used poorly, they have resulted in severe harms, but it's just worth keeping in mind they can be used in a way that improves or enhances health as well. So that's all I have presentation-wise, if anyone has any questions. Okay, so I'll answer those in turn. So the first one, I had a really good quote, which is in the thesis, from a gym owner who owns one of these more commercial type gyms. So it tends to be those sorts of subcultures that he's dealing with, more workout culture set and the lag culture. And he said one of the things he's noticed is with this increase in use and the sort of normalization, he thinks they just treat it as another product off the shelf. So they start off and they're like, okay, I want to build muscle, so I'll take protein shakes. Oh, now I want to lose fat, so I'll take this fat burner. Now I want even more gains, and now I'll take this pro-hormone, which is like this, it's almost a steroid, but it's not quite chemically one, so it's legal to sell, sort of in this grey area, and then from that it's very easy to then say, well, I might as well use injectable steroids. So he certainly, again, he's a gym owner rather than a participant, but he noticed that was occurring, and a few respondents sort of gave the suggestion that it does seem to be a progression. But at the same time, there are some cases, Josh, who I referenced, I've put him down as a gym user now, but he actually started more as one of these hedonic lag culture members because he started training when he was 19, before this really became a huge phenomenon, because he's in his late 20s now. So he started about 10 years ago, and he said that in his experience, he started training in the gym and all his friends were making these huge gains, getting really muscular, and he just couldn't keep up. And he said to one, "Oh, what's going on? I can't keep up with you guys." And his friend was like, "Oh, because we're taking this and this." So he just started taking that instantly after only 4 weeks of training because his friends were doing it. Now that's something you never see amongst powerlifters. The shortest period for a powerlifter to start using was Rich, who spent 15 months training before he started using steroids. But yeah, some of these young guys, they really are influenced, and it can either be this logical progression or it can just be because all your friends are on it, you then get on it. So there's sort of two angles to that. The second part of the question is an interesting one. I noted this, it's very weird that hedonic users in lag culture, they don't really follow any of the prescribed norms for use except they cycle steroids. So they're not on them all the time. And I thought that was really interesting because it kind of hinted at more understanding than their use patterns actually would otherwise let on. And what I think happens is they're almost cycling by accident because they're taking a huge amount in the spring and summer, then they're going on holiday, and then they're not bothering when they get back in autumn and winter. So it gives the impression that they're deliberately cycling, but actually it might just be because, oh, I need to get in shape for this period, and then they let it lapse. So I think a great example of this in popular culture is the TV show Jersey Shore. If anyone's ever watched that, you'll see when the guys come in the house, they're in much better shape than when they leave 6 or 8 weeks later, because they're not on steroids during the period they're in the house. So they get to the summer holiday and they look in really good shape. And then already by the end of summer, you can see they're losing that physique. Definitely. So it tends to be most of the judgment comes from the powerlifters, the fighters, the guys who see themselves as using it in the correct way, judging in the opposite direction. It seems to be more the individuals on the hedonic end don't seem to care. Essentially, they don't care that you think they're using in the wrong way because it's achieving the goals they want, because they have different values. Obviously, the powerlifters value long-term, continuous progression, and the guys just training for somewhere in Ibiza don't value that so much. So it tends to be a very one-way street in terms of criticism. Had some good examples of Mariusz, the wrestler, particularly. He was very critical of the guys who, he had a quote about, "There's no need to fill up the syringe. You're just being an idiot if you do that." And him and Jim, both as hardcore users, were particularly critical of the guys who are using steroids and then they're going out and getting drunk and getting in fights because they don't like how this is attributed to roid rage in the newspaper, and they're saying, look, we're on steroids, we've never had roid rage, it's not a real phenomenon, it's to do with these idiots who don't know how to use it properly. So there does seem to be a lot of criticism, particularly going in that direction, but really nothing coming back. So you could say it's because those in the competitive subcultures are much more invested in a certain image because they see the use as being identified with their sport. So they see anything that makes using steroids look bad makes their sport look bad. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's not those motivations. So I don't think there's so much need for that kind of criticism. Yeah. So it tends to be, I would say, powerlifters are the best example for the hardcore just because I spoke to more powerlifters than any other sportsmen. And they definitely see themselves as powerlifters and they identify as powerlifters. And within the more lag culture end, they identify more as we are a group of lads as opposed to we represent all lads. So there's 5 of us. It's them versus the outside, whereas powerlifters, it's we are representatives of our sport, so therefore we have to be concerned with what other people are doing. For lads, it's I have to be concerned with what my friend is doing, but I don't care what the guy over there is doing. I would definitely say it's primarily a working class subculture. It's tough to say. Essentially, there's kind of hints of a similar culture in university students with initiations and with nightclubs and binge drinking. So there is some overlap. I would say the more muscle-oriented version of that seems to be a more working class manifestation. So you could argue it's very similar culturally, but perhaps the working class has more of this masculine archetype where a man has to be big, and that's less present in the university type subcultures. But I would say there does seem to be some class factor to it. But even if we just kind of look at the workout culture and the different cultures of training for social media purposes, CrossFit is very much social media oriented.
Right.
And you see a lot of people who do CrossFit who are very clearly on steroids just based on their physiques. So I feel as though that might be a more middle class manifestation of this same underlying desire to look and present a certain way.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you very much. Great.
Yeah.